Hello and welcome to my IMP on the fight against slavery. I'm Nico Kiratsopoulos. This is my presentation for AP Seminar. So, first of all, the question is, what does it mean to fight slavery? My definition is basically any means of standing up to slavery with its end goal in being the end of slavery. So this can take place in either reformation, redemption, or abolition, with the intent to someday completely end the system. So a reformation approach, looking at the pictures, would be to focus on the mentality of the people and change some kind of underlying culture to persuade people to not take place of these practices anymore. Redemption approach would be to give money to people to satisfy their economic desires so that they do not continue the process of slavery. And the final approach would be an abolitionist approach, which would be removing the system entirely, whether this be through military force or some kind of forcible action. And what I've learned from looking at this topic is that the best approaches depend on the economic situation and capabilities of a certain nation. And these include, basically, if a country has a lot of money, then they can redeem and they can buy slaves from slave owners and take part in large abolition movements. However, for smaller communities like slaves in Egypt, it might be better to push for a more reformation process, which takes smaller or takes more time, but requires smaller resources. So, first looking at the Reformation approach, it is most evident in the article, it was in the book, actually, Hard Sayings, and that was examining the Old Testament and slavery, which basically looked and said that Moses, several times throughout this text, states and tries to get a higher standard of living for the slaves, and focuses the intent of the slavery is to basically get out of it. So, his reformation approach to slavery is to basically change the culture of slave owners to not keep their slaves forever and help to basically better the lives of both the slave owner and the slave. And so this approach takes a very long time. It's hard to convince people, but overall, if everyone listens and slave owners change how they act towards their slaves, it's better off for society, and it's easier for nations with a lot less power, like Moses versus the Egyptian government. He had less power but could make a significant change through this way. On the flip side, the English government was probably the most powerful nation at the time of their existence. And so having slaves in their empire, when they sought opposition to this, it was really kind of easy to use the redemption method. So it is stated in the National African American Reparations Commission, they made an article. They said that the British government paid somewhat of 3,000 families and upward to what the modern day would be like $20 million, or a lot more than that, to compensate for their loss of property with slave ownership. And so what this would do is the British government would take open an abolitionist movement, but first they would pay slave owners to make sure that they wouldn't stand up against this British government, and it kind of eased tension, and it allowed for, that solution. However, the downsides of this is definitely that without another approach like reformation or abolition, redeeming just perpetuates a cycle. So if you pay a slave owner to get rid of their slaves, but then they get more slaves and you pay them again, it's a full cycle that that perpetuated by a demand that's created by the government. So the way to fix that is the government using its resources to also push an abolitionist movement, which had little conflict due to the, agreements found by the slave owners since they were getting paid. But what if there is no giant commercial fund pushing this to pay off slave owners? What if it is a strictly abolitionist movement like in the American Revolutionary War? Civil War, I'm sorry. So in this situation, United States soldiers and abolitionist movements across the country fought for the abolition of slavery. And to get rid of all slaves, it basically split the country into the North and the South, with slave owners taking basically aggressive stances against people in the North. And so it was very hard for the U.S. to proceed without this massive, deadly conflict. And even though the North succeeded in their right, they lost, or they were risking basically the entire country for the movement. It was super deadly, super the costs and the benefits, there's a great wager there whether it was worth it. Another thing to look at is that there were hundreds and tens of years where there were still conflicts after the Civil War, where states would try to secede, or there would be different rulings in states. We saw the Jim Crow laws, where those former slaves who had been freed were still treated unfairly. And so through an abolition approach, you're basically confronting someone without any kind of attempts to bring them to your side, and this leads to basically conflict in every situation. So when looking at this, we can see that basically it depends on the economic capabilities of a country to determine what approach they should take, but the best approaches are either a reformation attempt, which takes a lot of time, or a redemption combined with an abolition attempt. You can't have redemption by itself, you can't have abolition by itself, but together they make a strong argument, like the British argument did, the British government did, because it is important to basically convince the other side to not revolt and have conflict, because that is like the majority of where conflict sparks regarding slavery in the modern world today. And we can bring this to the modern world to basically look at like how can we fix our modern slave problems, and a lot of this is just looking for the cause, which is a lot of slave owners basically see that it's super profitable to do human trafficking and all these things related to slavery. So maybe a redemption method would be helpful to certain governments, while promoting religion and trying to reform the people may be better in certain other regions. But using data that's been collected from the Global Slavery Index and understanding the demographics of each region, we can take these different approaches. So the conclusion is basically it depends on the economic capabilities, depends on the culture of the people per situation, but understanding this difference can allow us to not have like a blanket approach to abolition is the best way. And it can allow for different countries and states to take what is best for them and to overall fix the problem on a more individual level. Thank you. These are my citations. I included the source given to us in class at the bottom just because I had found the book, and so I figured I'd include it. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed, and yeah.